The plane was airworthy. The crew was as experienced as they come. The weather was clear. And yet, within a few hours, Flight 261 would drop into an almost vertical, inverted dive and slam into the ocean. 88 people on board, not a single survivor. What can kill an airliner that's perfectly sound on paper? One part in the tail, about the size of a fist, worn down almost to nothing. This is the story of an Alaska Airlines MD-83 flying home from Mexico. A story about the courage of two pilots who fought for their aircraft until the very last second, and about how cutting 1 hour of maintenance ended in the loss of an entire airplane. The question here is simple and terrifying. This disaster could have been prevented, so why wasn't it? January 31st, the year 2000. On the runway of the Mexican resort of Puerto Vallarta sits a McDonnell Douglas MD-83 belonging to Alaska Airlines. This is Flight 261. And its route is about as routine as it gets for late winter, from warm Mexico heading north, with a stop in San Francisco and a final destination of Seattle. There are 88 people on board, 83 passengers and 5 crew members. Most of them are heading home after a vacation by the ocean. Families, couples, holidaymakers. Many are employees of the airline itself, traveling with their loved ones on staff tickets. They settle into their seats, buckle up, and get ready for a long but uneventful flight. The plane is airworthy, at least according to the paperwork. The weather is clear, visibility excellent, and at the controls is a crew for whom flights like this are nothing new. Captain Ted Thompson has logged more than 17,000 hours and has worked at Alaska Airlines for nearly 20 years. Beside him, the first officer, also a veteran with many years on this type of aircraft. For men like these, a flight out of Mexico is everyday work, the kind they've done thousands of times. And in the tail of this aircraft, in the mechanism that controls the angle of the nose, a defect has been quietly building for several years. A part designed to last tens of thousands of hours has been worn down almost to the limit. Neither the captain, nor the first officer, nor the passengers, flipping through magazines in the cabin, know anything about it. Not a soul on board even suspects that this small piece of the tail is living out its final hours. In a few hours, none of this calm will remain. The airliner will tumble toward the waters of the Pacific. What can jam in a sound aircraft so badly that there's no saving it? To understand what happened that day, you have to understand the machine itself and the people who flew it. The aircraft, registration N963 Alpha Sierra, rolled off the assembly line in 1992. By the time of the crash, it had logged around 26,000 hours, which for an airliner is a working age, still far from old. In the cockpit, 2 top-class pilots. Captain Ted Thompson is 53 years old, and thousands of his flight hours were spent on exactly this kind of aircraft, the MD-80 family. His first officer, Bill Tansky, age 57, has also flown many thousands of hours on this type. These two knew their machine inside and out. Now, about that part of the tail around which the whole tragedy will unfold. For a plane to raise or lower its nose during a long flight, there's a movable horizontal surface in the tail, the stabilizer. Think of it as a small second wing at the back that can be tilted. Tilt it, and the nose of the aircraft goes up or down. That's how an airliner holds the right angle at cruising altitude, without the pilots constantly working the controls. The stabilizer is moved by a clever mechanism, a jackscrew. Picture an ordinary vise. You turn the screw, and a nut travels along it. This is the same idea. A long, threaded screw rotates, and the nut threaded onto it slowly crawls up or down, pulling the stabilizer along with it. A simple, reliable part, and an absolutely critical one. The trouble is that the entire support of the stabilizer rests on the threads of this single nut. Wear away those threads, and the stabilizer is left hanging with nothing to hold it. And there was no backup mechanism on this aircraft for such a case. What happens if that one nut wears down to the limit? In the air, everything begins calmly. The plane lifts off the Puerto Vallarta runway, climbs, and turns north along the coast. The aircraft is responsive, the engines run smoothly, the crew goes about its familiar work. The airliner climbs to its cruising level, around 31,000 feet, which is roughly 9.5 kilometers. And right here, at this altitude, comes the first sign of trouble. The stabilizer, that movable surface in the tail, stops moving. The trim system, which adjusts the angle of the stabilizer so the pilots don't have to keep pushing on the controls, simply freezes. The The commands to change its position go through, but back in the tail, nothing happens. Soon, the autopilot disconnects. On an aircraft like this, it's a logical response. The automation can't manage the balancing act and hands control back to the humans. The captain and the first officer take the controls in their hands. Now they're flying the plane manually. It doesn't end with the autopilot. The stabilizer is stuck in a position that isn't really suited for continued flight. To hold altitude and keep the nose from dropping, the pilots have to pull back on the controls constantly and with noticeable force. Tiring, but manageable. The plane is flying, responding, holding course. There's no panic in the cockpit. For an experienced crew, a jammed trim is a malfunction, a nuisance, a reason to sort things out and make a decision, but not a reason to fear the worst. They've flown with all sorts of failures, and they know the aircraft has a big safety margin. Calmly, they analyze the situation, check the systems, search for the cause, and that's exactly where the treachery lies. What looks right now like a routine technical snag is in fact the first visible crack in a mechanism that's already nearly destroyed. How serious is the thing that feels to them like an ordinary failure? Unable to solve it on their own, the crew does what the procedures call for. They reach out to the ground. The pilots contact air traffic control and their airline's maintenance technicians in Seattle. Over the radio, they describe the problem in detail. The stabilizer trim isn't working, and the plane has to be flown by hand. A long conversation begins. The captain and the technicians work through the systems together, trying to figure out exactly what has failed. The crew checks everything that can be checked from the cockpit, but the cause of the jam is never found. The plane keeps flying north, held up by the hands of the pilots. And here arises a question that will turn out to be one of the key ones in the whole story. Land immediately, or push on to the planned airport? The crew has a choice. Below them is the California coast, several airports suitable for landing. Captain Thompson leans toward Los Angeles. There, he says, the runway is dry and the wind usually blows favorably along it. A reasonable, professional argument. But something else slips into the conversation with the ground. From the side coordinating the flight comes a hint about the inconvenience. Change the route, land somewhere other than planned, and that means delays, missed connections for passengers, a snag in the schedule. The recordings of these communications will later show that the crew was indirectly given to understand that continuing on to San Francisco would be more convenient for the company. Let's be honest. The final decision always rested with the captain, and the investigation would later not name this conversation as a direct cause of the crash. But the simple fact that, at a moment of serious malfunction, safety sat on one side of the scale and the schedule on the other, says a great deal about the atmosphere these people worked in. While the talks go on, the plane stays in the air and passes by airfields where it could have landed. Why doesn't an aircraft with a failing control system put down at once, at the first opportunity? The very attempt to get to the bottom of the cause leads to the decision that will change everything. From the ground, the crew is offered a different approach. Switch on both stabilizer control systems at once, the primary and the backup. The idea is logical, the thought being that maybe the jammed mechanism can be nudged loose. The pilots flip the switches, and the mechanism does give way, only not at all the way anyone expected. In the cockpit, a sharp bang. The plane is hit by violent vibration. A warning alarm sounds, and the stabilizer, instead of returning to a usable position, breaks free and runs to its extreme point, fully nose down. That surface in the tail, the one that kept the aircraft balanced, is now driving the nose of the plane toward the ground with everything it's got. What the crew feared most has happened. The airliner sharply drops its nose and plunges downward into a dive. From level flight at cruising altitude, the plane goes into a steep descent in an instant. The G-forces shift, passengers are pressed into their seats, loose objects fly up to the cabin ceiling. What happened inside the tail in that second? This attempt to shake loose the jammed assembly was the last straw for the exhausted, nearly worn-out jackscrew nut. As long as the threads were still catching on each other somehow, the stabilizer was simply jammed, and that held it in a relatively safe position. But the moment the mechanism was forced to move, The last load-bearing surface couldn't take it and gave way. The stabilizer ran to its extreme position, and there was nothing to stop it. Just like that, a single action instantly turned a manageable malfunction into a deadly threat. The plane, calmly flown by hand a minute ago, is now heading down. What exactly broke in the tail, and can it still be fixed? Now comes something that's hard to imagine from the comfort of a viewer's chair. In a matter of seconds, the airliner loses an enormous amount of altitude, around 7,000 feet, more than 2 kilometers. The stabilizer forces the nose down, and the pilots resist with their whole bodies. They haul back on the controls with monstrous effort, and the instruments would later show that together they pulled on the controls with a force of hundreds of kilograms. This is not a figure of speech. To force the nose up even a little against the jammed stabilizer, 2 grown men have to literally wrench the control columns toward them, straining with all their might. Every second of that struggle is a physical battle between a human and a broken machine. The captain reports to the controller, short and to the point. They're in a dive. They've lost vertical control of the aircraft. Not one wasted emotion on the air, only the absolute composure of a man fighting for the lives of 88 people behind him. And then the almost impossible happens. At the cost of superhuman effort, the crew stops the fall. The nose of the plane gradually rises, the rate of descent drops, the aircraft levels out. The airliner settles at an altitude of around 24,000 feet, lower than before, but back in relatively level flight. For a few minutes, they've tamed a falling airplane with their bare hands. In the cockpit, they can catch their breath. The passengers, who were just pressed into their seats, feel level flight beneath them again. Only, this calm is deceptive. The stabilizer is still wrenched into its extreme position, and the only thing keeping the plane level is the constant, exhausting force of the pilot's arms. They have control, but at the very edge of what's possible. How long can this fragile balance hold? The crew uses this reprieve to make their final decision. They're landing in Los Angeles. San Francisco is set aside. There's no time for schedule convenience now. The only thing that matters is getting the plane safely onto the ground. The captain requests permission to descend and to start preparing for the approach. The pilots act with extreme caution. They've learned the hard way just how dangerous it is to touch the stabilizer system. One wrong move nearly killed them minutes ago. Now they try not to meddle with the tail any more than they have to, so as not to accidentally trigger another runaway. The captain wants to descend over the open ocean, away from populated areas, and there carefully test how well the aircraft responds at lower speed and in the landing configuration. On the ground, the airline's technicians are by now beginning to grasp the full gravity of the situation. It dawns on them. The stabilizer has gone to full nose down, and there's no getting it back. This is no longer a routine malfunction you land with at the nearest convenient airfield. This is a fight for the survival of an entire airplane. And yet, at this moment, it still seems the people on board have a chance. The plane is flying, even if it's holding on at the limit. The coast isn't far. The crew keeps its composure, acts skillfully, prepares for landing. 88 people are still alive, and somewhere ahead lies an airport runway ready to receive the wounded airliner. But all of it hangs on one thin condition. The worn jackscrew nut has to hold out just a little longer. The mechanism that already gave way once under load is now carrying the entire weight of holding the stabilizer. There are almost no threads left on it, and it's working at its very last limit. Will it survive these decisive minutes until landing? The answer comes within a few minutes, and it's merciless. As the crew carefully prepares to descend, the fragile balance collapses. The flight data recorder captures a series of dull impacts, several distinct knocks in a row. In the stabilizer mechanism, something is beginning to tear apart for good. A few more moments, and a deafening noise comes. The last thing holding the stabilizer rips free. The threads of the jackscrew nut strip completely. Of that nearly worn-out part that held the entire tail, nothing remains capable of bearing the load. This is no longer a jam you can fight with your hands. This is the complete physical destruction of the pitch control mechanism. The stabilizer, stripped of its last support, twists once and for all into its extreme position and stands almost vertical. It is no longer part of a controllable airplane. It has become a giant surface driving the nose of the plane downward with all its force. The airliner reacts instantly. The nose snaps toward the earth. The plane begins to roll over and bank. The G-forces shift again, this time even more sharply. The very thing the pilots managed to overcome minutes ago has returned, and in a far more terrifying form. Back then, at least the stabilizer stayed where it was. Now the last support beneath it is gone. The first time, the crew tore the plane out of the dive through unimaginable effort. But back then, there was still some connection between the controls and the tail. Now that connection is gone. No matter how hard the pilots pull on the controls, the stabilizer won't budge. There's simply nothing left to move it. There is no road back to controlled flight anymore. The plane goes into a dive from which it can no longer be recovered by ordinary means. What can pilots even do when the tail of their aircraft has stopped responding entirely? And in this hopeless situation, the captain and the first officer do the thing that sets true professionals apart from everyone else. They don't give up. The plane breaks into a steep spiral and rolls onto its back, flying upside down. And even like this, the crew keeps searching for a way out. On the recording, you can hear the captain calmly directing his partner, push and roll, push and roll. They're trying to find any position in which the plane becomes controllable again. And this isn't despair, it's a methodical, desperately brave attempt to save the aircraft by unconventional means when every ordinary option has already failed. An inverted plane behaves differently, and the pilots try to use that. At one point, a phrase is spoken in the cockpit that everyone familiar with this story now knows. At least upside down, we're still flying. In those words is the very essence of these men. The plane is inverted and hurtling toward the ocean, and they note that in this position, it's at least staying in the air, and they try to seize on that. They fight until the last second recorded by the black box. They don't panic, they don't let go. They search for any chance right to the end. But physics cannot be cheated. The stabilizer is destroyed. There's no altitude left, no time remaining. Flight 261 falls at high speed into the Pacific Ocean near Anacapa Island, off the California coast. All 88 people on board are killed. There are no survivors. Pilots from planes passing nearby saw the final moments and reported them over the radio, restrained and terrible in their simplicity. It just hit the water. Later, every action they took in the cockpit would be examined from the recordings and judged exemplary. No human being could have done more than they did. But another central question arises. Was it ever even possible to save this plane, or was its fate sealed long before takeoff? When rescuers and investigators arrive on the scene, the picture at first looks like a mystery, a modern airplane, sound on paper, two veteran pilots who acted skillfully, clear weather without the faintest hint of a storm or icing. None of the usual causes explains why the flight plunged into the ocean. The investigation is taken on by the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, the agency that examines every major air disaster in the country. The plane went into the water, which means the evidence lies on the floor of the Pacific. A long, painstaking effort begins. Wreckage is raised from the seabed, the bodies of the victims are recovered, and the search goes on for the black boxes, the flight data recorder, and the cockpit voice recorder. Among the many recovered fragments, the investigators find something that immediately sets the direction of the entire investigation. It's the stabilizer jackscrew assembly, the very system of screw and nut that controlled the angle of the tail. And the condition of this assembly speaks for itself. Wrapped around the screw are the stripped remnants of the threads. The nut, which was supposed to sit tightly on the screw and bear the entire stabilizer, is essentially destroyed. Its threads have literally been torn off, scraps of metal wound around the screw. This doesn't look like a one-time break from the impact with the water. This is the mark of long, gradual wear that ended in a complete strip-out. The find immediately cuts off whole avenues of theories. Not terrorism, no trace of an explosion, not the weather, and not a piloting error on its own. The cause turned out to be inside the machine itself, in a specific tail mechanism that physically broke apart in flight. But this one answer immediately gives rise to a new, even more troubling question. A jack screw is designed with an enormous safety margin, precisely because the control of the airplane depends on it. It's supposed to last a very long time. So why did it wear out and fall apart long before the end of its service life? The recovered nut is examined under a microscope and in the lab, and the numbers turn out to be staggering. The threads are worn down to nearly 90% of their designed thickness. Of the strong, reliable connection that was supposed to bear the entire stabilizer, only a thin strip of metal remains. The last few percent, with nothing left to physically hold on to. But most astonishing of all is the speed at which this wear occurred. By the designer's calculations, the threads should wear away extremely slowly, a fraction of a millimeter over thousands of flight hours. But on this aircraft, the metal wore down dozens of times faster than normal. A part meant to last for decades was wearing out at a catastrophic rate. The investigators find the reason for this speed by examining the mechanism up close. There's no working lubricant on the screw and nut. The channels through which the grease is supposed to reach the rubbing surfaces are clogged with dry, hardened residue. Put plainly, metal was grinding against metal with nothing to lubricate it. Anyone who has ever dealt with mechanisms knows what happens without lubrication. The stabilizer jack screw works constantly. The flight regime changes, and the nut crawls up or down the screw. And it does so thousands upon thousands of times over the life of an airplane. With grease, the metal slides and barely wears. Without it, every movement shaves a microscopic layer off the threads, and turn by turn, almost nothing is left of the once strong nut. And so, a clear physical picture of the final seconds takes shape. There was almost nothing left for the nut to hold on to, while the load on it during flight only grew, and the metal simply couldn't take it. The last of the threads stripped away, and the stabilizer lost its support. That was enough to doom an entire airplane with 88 people aboard. The investigators now have a direct physical cause, but behind it stands a completely different question, no longer technical, but human. How did it come to pass that a part left without lubricant and worn away almost entirely went unnoticed during scheduled maintenance? Here, the story of a broken part gives way to the story of decisions made by people at desks, far from the cockpit of the airplane. To keep the stabilizer jack screw from wearing down, it has to be lubricated regularly, a simple, mandatory operation prescribed by the manufacturer. And around how often it was actually performed, the central drama of the investigation unfolds. The investigators uncover something alarming. For many years, Alaska Airlines had quietly been stretching out the intervals between lubrications of the jack screw, and it did so with the blessing of the aviation authorities, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. Time after time, the gap between servicings was increased, and each time it was approved. The numbers show just how far it had gone. At first, lubrication was meant to be done frequently, every few hundred flight hours. By the end of the 90s, the interval had been stretched to thousands of flight hours and many months of calendar time. What was once done regularly was now performed many times less often. The same fate befell another crucial procedure, the end play check of the jack screw. This is a special measurement that shows how much the nut's threads have worn. The greater the free play, the more the metal has been ground away. It's the only reliable way to catch dangerous wear ahead of time. But the interval between these checks was lengthened too. The logic here is ironclad and chilling at the same time. The less often a part is lubricated, the faster it wears. And the less often the end play is checked, the longer that wear grows unnoticed. Two decisions like these, made for the sake of savings, layered on top of each other. The safety margin that the designers had built into the airplane precisely to allow for human error was slowly eaten away, year by year, approval by approval. And still, there remained one last line of defense. Even with infrequent checks, at least one of them should have caught the critical wear and stopped the disaster. Could that check have saved the plane? And why didn't it? The answer to this question is perhaps the bitterest of the entire investigation. The last time the end play of the jack screw on this aircraft was measured was several years before the crash. And it was precisely that check that should have changed the course of events. Only, it didn't work, and for reasons that could have been avoided. The problem was the tool. To measure the wear, you need a special device made strictly to the manufacturer's specifications. That's the only way to get an accurate result. But in practice, a homemade tool was used, one that didn't meet the factory requirements, and that incorrect tool gave a low reading. According to it, the wear was within limits, the part was serviceable, and there was no need to replace it. In reality, the threads by that point were already worn far more than the measurement showed. The check that exists for the very purpose of catching such wear went ahead and missed a lethally dangerous defect. The plane was released back into service as fully airworthy. And there is one more episode in this story that makes it truly hard to bear. One of the mechanics inspecting the plane decided the jack screw needed to be replaced and wrote it down that way. There it was, the very chance to save 88 lives. But following a subsequent review, that recommendation was not accepted, and the part was left on the aircraft. So it turns out there were several points at which the disaster could still have been prevented. Lubricate more often, and the wear would have been stopped. Use the right tool, and the real picture would have been seen. Had the company listened to the mechanic, the jack screw would have been replaced in time. And not one of these lines held. Every single one failed. For a single airplane, such a chain of errors looks almost unbelievable. And you can't help wondering, was this aircraft an exception? Did anyone inside the company even know that the maintenance system was failing in a serious way? And here's the most disturbing part. Warnings of danger had been sounding even before Flight 261 took to the air. Long before the crash, one of Alaska Airlines' mechanics, John Leotine, went to the aviation authorities with serious accusations. According to him, the company was documenting maintenance as completed, when in reality, some of the work was never done. One thing on paper, another in the actual condition of the aircraft. Leotine went all the way, and it had consequences. As early as the end of 1998, more than a year before the tragedy, government agencies conducted a search at one of the airline's facilities and seized maintenance records. In other words, the problems in Alaska Airlines' maintenance system were on the authorities' radar while the flight was still flying. After the crash, a special review tied to the investigation revealed the scale of these problems. The defects in the maintenance of the aircraft turned out not to be a fluke of one airplane. It was a system, an approach in which safety lost out, time after time, to savings and deadlines. No less important was the role of the oversight body. The FAA, which is supposed to monitor how airlines maintain their aircraft, had failed for years to notice what was happening right under its nose. It was the FAA that approved the stretched lubrication and inspection intervals. The oversight that was meant to be a barrier on the road to disaster turned out to be too weak itself. And so the full picture finally comes together. It wasn't about one negligent mechanic, and not about a single missed check. It was about a system where cutting corners on maintenance had become the norm, where warning signs were ignored, and where oversight looked the other way. The worn jack screw nut was merely the last physical link in this long chain. All that remained was to hear the most important word, the official conclusion of the investigation. What did the NTSB ultimately decide, after examining every circumstance of the loss of Flight 261? The final report of the investigation states the cause strictly and without mincing words. The direct cause of the crash is named as a loss of pitch control resulting from the in-flight failure of the stabilizer jack screw nut threads. That very tail mechanism, stripped of its support, sent the flight into the ocean. But the investigators go deeper and name the root of this failure. The threads wore down because of a lack of lubrication, and there wasn't enough lubrication because Alaska Airlines had stretched out the maintenance intervals. This is not a guess, but an official finding. The critical wear was a direct consequence of how the company maintained its aircraft. The report also lists the contributing factors, without which the tragedy would not have happened. Among them are the extended intervals for checking the jack screw end play, and the fact that the aviation authorities approved these relaxations. These decisions allowed the lethal wear to develop right to the end, without ever once being noticed. Separately, the investigators point to a feature of the design itself. This family of aircraft had no emergency mechanism for the case of a complete strip-out of the nut threads. The designers had assumed that the threads simply could not wear away completely if the part was properly maintained. And when the maintenance failed, there was nothing left to hold the stabilizer. No backup device for such a case had been provided in the aircraft. One of the members of the investigative board put what happened as plainly as possible. This is a maintenance disaster, not a fatal coincidence, and not an uncontrollable force of nature, and not an error by an exhausted crew. The plane was destroyed by the way it had been cared for on the ground. And this is perhaps the hardest thing about the story of Flight 261. The deaths of 88 people were not inevitable. At various stages, they could still have been stopped. It would have been enough for just one line of defense to hold. But since the disaster did happen, a question remained for the future. What lessons did world aviation draw from it? This loss did not pass without a trace. It changed the rules by which the whole world flies. As a result of the investigation, the NTSB issued dozens of recommendations about lubrication, about inspections, about the oversight of airlines. The requirements for maintaining the jackscrew on aircraft of this family were tightened. Lubricate more often, inspect more thoroughly, and don't trust homemade tools. The approach to the dangerous part itself changed too. Engineers set about something that hadn't existed before. A fail-safe design for the jackscrew with a backup nut. The idea is simple and logical. If the main threads strip, the spare will hold the stabilizer and keep the plane from breaking into an uncontrollable dive. The very last line of defense that Flight 261 so desperately lacked. The airline itself overhauled its maintenance under the close scrutiny of the authorities and the public. And a few years later, Alaska Airlines retired this type of aircraft from its fleet entirely, moving on to other planes. The era in which the disaster happened came to a close in that sense too. But behind the dry lines of reforms, there are people. Captain Ted Thompson and First Officer Bill Tansky were posthumously honored for their courage. In an inverted, disintegrating airplane, they held on to the controls for as long as there was any sense in doing so. They could not have won. The outcome was decided back on the ground, by the condition of that very nut. They bear not an ounce of blame for what happened. In memory of the victims, a memorial in the form of a sundial was set up by the ocean shore. Every year on January 31st, the anniversary of the crash, the shadow it casts touches, at a certain moment, the plate bearing the names of all 88 people who never came home. The story of Flight 261 is not really about a piece of metal in the tail. It's about how a chain of small decisions, made to save time and money, ate away, step by step, at the protection built into the airplane. And the terrifying question it leaves behind sounds like this: how much does a single saved hour of maintenance really cost?